Hello, are you an innocent spouse and need relief from IRS tax debt? Let's find out more. When you file a joint income tax return, the law makes both you and your spouse responsible for the entire tax liability. This is called joint and several liability. Joint and several liability applies not only to the tax liability you show on the return, but also any additional tax liability the IRS determines to be due, even if the additional tax is due to income, deductions, or credits of your spouse or former spouse. You remain jointly and severally liable for taxes, and the IRS can still collect from you even if you later divorce, and a divorce decree states that your former spouse will be solely responsible for the tax. In some cases, a spouse or former spouse will be relieved of the tax, interest, and penalties on a joint return. These types of relief are available to married persons who filed joint returns: innocent spouse relief, separation of liability relief, and equitable relief. Let's first discuss innocent spouse relief. To be eligible for innocent spouse relief, you must meet all of the following conditions to qualify. First, you filed a joint return that has an understatement of tax liability that's solely attributable to your spouse's erroneous item. An erroneous item may include income received by your spouse but not included on the joint tax return. Deductions, credits, and property basis are also erroneous items if they're incorrectly reported. You establish at the time you signed the joint return that you didn't know or had no reason to know that there was an understatement of tax. And, taking into account all the facts and circumstances, it would be unfair to hold you liable for the understatement of tax. The IRS also requires that you did not transfer property between each other. Separation of liability relief provides for the separate allocation of additional tax owed between you and your former spouse or your current spouse if you're legally separated from or not living with when an item wasn't reported properly on a joint tax return. You're then responsible for the amount of tax allocated to you. Refunds aren't available under separation of liability relief. To qualify for separation of liability relief, you must have filed a joint return and must meet one of the following requirements at the time you request relief. Number one, you're divorced or legally separated from the spouse from who you filed the joint return with. You're widowed, or you haven't been a member of the same household as the spouse with whom you filed the joint return at any time during the 12-month period ending on the date you request relief. You must also not have had knowledge of the actual item that raised your tax liability at the time you signed your joint tax return, unless you can show that you signed the return under duress. If you do not qualify for innocent spouse relief or separation of liability, you may still be relieved of your responsibility for tax, interest, and penalties through equitable relief. You may qualify for equitable relief if you meet all of the following conditions. You are not eligible for innocent spouse relief, relief by separation of liability, or relief from liability arising from community property law. You and your spouse or former spouse did not transfer assets to one another as part of a fraudulent scheme. You did not file or fail to file your return with an intent to commit fraud. You established that, taking into account all the facts and circumstances, it would be unfair to hold you liable for the understatement or underpayment of tax. And lastly, the income tax from which you seek relief must be attributable to an item of the spouse or former spouse with whom you filed the joint return. If your request for equitable relief is granted, then you will be eligible for a refund. Keep in mind, there is a limit on the amount of the refund. Factors for determining whether to grant equitable relief include whether you're separated or divorced from your spouse. This actually can include temporary absences, such as absence due to imprisonment or military service. Whether or not you would suffer a significant economic hardship if relief is not granted. Does your former spouse have a legal obligation under a divorce decree for the agreement to pay the tax? whether you have made a good faith effort to comply with federal income tax laws for the years for which the tax you are requesting relief or the following years. And lastly, whether you knew or had reason to know about items causing the understatement or that the tax would not be paid. And that's another edition of Tax Tip of the Day. Do you have an IRS problem you need resolved? Call the licensed tax experts at Patriot Tax Professionals, 877-782-9383. That's 877-782-9383.